The village of St. Mary Mead had never seemed quieter than on that overcast autumn morning. A pale fog lingered over the hedgerows, muting the colors of the turning leaves and casting a subdued, almost melancholy air over the tidy cottages. It was a day that begged for a quiet cup of tea and a thoughtful glance out of the window, but the village was not destined for quiet contemplation. Today, the entire community would gather at St. Mary Mead Parish Church for the funeral of Dr. Horace Haydock, the local physician, whose sudden death had shaken even the most composed of residents. Miss Jane Marple, as usual, was already dressed in her modest best, a navy woolen coat, a gray hat with a small sprig of artificial lavender pinned neatly on one side, and her sensible shoes, polished to a soft gleam. She stood for a moment on the front step of her cottage, inhaling the faint chill of the morning, her sharp eyes scanning the hedges for any early risers. A gentle nip in the air made her grateful for the warmth of her cardigan beneath her coat. It was true that Dr. Haydock had been elderly, 72, according to the parish register, but he had always been a robust man, cheerful in manner and diligent in practice. To hear that he had died so suddenly, and at home, caused a ripple of unease. Miss Marple, who had known the doctor in passing for decades, felt a quiet prickle of curiosity. There was something about the timing and manner of his death that did not sit entirely right with her. At the church, the pews filled gradually. The familiar faces of St. Mary Mead gathered in soft whispers, Mrs. Dolly Bantry, the vicar's wife, fussing with her gloves, Mr. Lawrence Rivington, the local solicitor, glancing at his pocket watch, and Miss Emily Winter, the village florist, her hands folded tightly in front of her, as though bracing for a cold wind of grief. Even the village children, sent by parents to keep them from prying eyes, peered curiously from behind the church pillars. Miss Marple walked slowly down the aisle, observing everything with her customary attentiveness. She noted Reverend Peter Carruthers, adjusting his collar nervously, and a few strangers whom she did not immediately recognize. There was a family, 2 sons, a daughter, and a plainly anxious woman who was presumably Dr. Haydock's housekeeper, standing together near the front. Miss Marple could tell by their mannerisms that grief was tinged with tension. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Mrs. Bantry in a low voice as she passed, her eyes misty but alert. "I don't suppose anyone will ever know exactly how poor Horace passed so suddenly." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Sometimes, my dear Dolly, the truth is not in what is said, but in what is left unsaid." She let the words linger, allowing them to float above the subdued crowd like the curling smoke of the incense, before taking her seat near the back of the church. The service began with a solemn hymn, the rich tones of the organ echoing through the stone walls. Miss Marple's sharp gaze, however, wandered, as it always did. She noticed subtle gestures, the twitch of Mr. Rivington's hand, the way the daughter clutched her mother's arm, the restless shifting of the housekeeper's feet. There were little tells everywhere, and to Miss Marple, they spoke louder than any sermon. As Reverend Carruthers read the Psalms, Miss Marple reflected quietly. Dr. Haydock had been a man of routine and propriety. His morning rounds, his habitual tea at the vicarage, his gentle reminders about preventive care, everything was orderly and predictable. And yet, here he was, removed from that orderly life in a way that seemed abrupt. Even in death, there was a question that hovered invisibly around him, like a shadow. After the service, the small congregation moved to the churchyard, where the coffin rested on the lowering device above a fresh grave. The cool air smelled faintly of damp earth and chrysanthemums. A small group clustered near the grave, exchanging subdued condolences. Miss Marple, as always, remained slightly apart, observing the interplay of expressions and gestures. It was then that she noticed the first peculiar detail. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Hargreaves, was speaking to someone in a low, hurried whisper. Her eyes darted nervously over the heads of the mourners. Meanwhile, one of Dr. Haydock's sons, Edward, kept glancing at the coffin as if ensuring that it remained firmly closed. His brother, Philip, appeared more composed, yet his tight jaw and the way he shifted from foot to foot betrayed an undercurrent of agitation. Miss Marple's curiosity was pricked further when she overheard a fragment of Mrs. Hargreaves's whisper. "Not supposed to know until tomorrow. What if anyone finds out?" Her mind worked quietly, piecing together the implications. Why should knowledge of Dr. Haydock's passing be restricted, even for a day? What could be so sensitive that it could not be shared even with his own family? By the time the coffin was lowered, the small gathering had dispersed, leaving Miss Marple with a few lingering figures. Miss Winter lingered near the freshly turned earth, apparently arranging flowers, but her hands trembled slightly. Mr. Rivington exchanged polite but tight nods with the family, and Mrs. Bantry, sensing Miss Marple's keen observation, approached her. "Something troubles you, Jane?" she asked gently, using the familiar form of address. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes still scanning the churchyard. "Only the usual, Dolly. I find that sudden deaths tend to reveal as much about the living as the departed." Mrs. Bantry frowned, perhaps not fully comprehending the remark, and Miss Marple let it pass. The truth, she knew, would emerge in its own time, if one merely watched carefully enough. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favorite armchair, a cup of steaming tea at her elbow. She allowed herself a few minutes of quiet reflection. Dr. Haydock had been a man liked and respected, yet in every community, appearances could be deceptive. People smiled, nodded, and paid polite homage, all the while concealing grudges, jealousies, and unspoken resentments. And in her experience, such hidden currents often revealed themselves most clearly at moments like these: funerals, weddings, and other gatherings where social masks slipped, however briefly. Her thoughts were interrupted by a polite knock at the door. She rose slowly, smoothing her cardigan, and opened it to reveal a young woman she did not recognize. She was neatly dressed in black, with a delicate veil partially obscuring her face. "Miss Marple," the woman asked, her voice trembling slightly. I wonder if you might help me. My name is Clara Worthing. I was Dr. Haydock's niece, and I have reason to believe that his death might not have been entirely natural." Miss Marple invited her in, gesturing to the chair opposite her own. As Clara sat, Miss Marple observed her closely, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the tight clench of her hands, the careful modulation of her voice. Everything spoke of a young woman both anxious and resolute. "You see," Clara began, "Dr. Haydock was in good health, as far as we knew. But when I arrived yesterday, I found him unwell in a way that seemed unusual. And then there is this matter of certain letters and instructions he left behind, letters that I fear might have been intercepted or ignored." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. I have often found that letters, instructions, and other minor details reveal far more than the grand gestures of mourning." She sipped her tea, allowing the warmth to settle her thoughts. "Tell me everything, Miss Worthing. Every small detail may prove significant." As Clara began recounting the events leading up to Dr. Haydock's death, the clock ticked quietly in the corner. The village beyond Miss Marple's window remained calm, unaware of the storm of subtle intrigues that were beginning to stir. And in the quiet of her little cottage, Miss Marple felt that familiar spark of curiosity, the one that always preceded a mystery. It was, she knew, the very first thread of a puzzle. And she would follow it, carefully, patiently, until she had unraveled the truth hidden beneath the polite smiles and whispered words of St. Mary Mead. The morning after Dr. Haydock's funeral dawned cold and crisp, the kind of morning that pressed the cheeks to a pale pink and made the breath mist in little clouds. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night in thought, rose early as usual. She wrapped herself in her navy coat and set out for a short walk through the village, ostensibly to gather her thoughts, but in truth to observe, as she always did, the world in its smallest movements. St. Mary Mead was stirring slowly. Shop shutters were lifted, the blacksmith's hammer clinked rhythmically from the far end of the lane, and the postman wheeled his bicycle down the cobbled path with a quiet diligence. Miss Marple paused outside Winter's florist, noting that Miss Emily Winter was arranging chrysanthemums with unusual care, her gloved hands trembling just enough to betray a frazzled composure. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Emily, straightening with a nervous smile. "Did you attend the funeral yesterday?" "I did," Miss Marple replied softly, her sharp eyes taking in the carefully arranged flowers. "And I noticed that your hands were quite unsteady. A little excitement, perhaps?" Emily flushed slightly. "Oh, I'm just tired, you know. The funeral, it's unsettling." Miss Marple inclined her head, saying nothing further. She knew that the smallest detail often concealed the largest truths. Even the trembling of a florist's hands could hint at secrets not meant for ordinary eyes. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited Mr. Lawrence Rivington, the local solicitor, under the pretext of asking about routine paperwork for a client. In reality, she wished to observe his demeanor and mannerisms. Mr. Rivington greeted her politely but with a stiffness that suggested more than mere professional reserve. "Miss Marple," he said, smoothing his jacket, "I suppose you've heard of the little complication regarding Dr. Haydock's will?" Miss Marple nodded politely. "I have not, Mr. Rivington." "What sort of complication?" He glanced around the room, lowering his voice. "It appears that the doctor made several amendments in recent weeks. Some bequests are unusual. Some, one might say, could cause family tensions." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. Unusual bequests often reveal the state of a person's mind, or the nature of those around them, she remarked quietly. "Would you care to share any particulars?" Rivington hesitated, then spoke cautiously. "There's a sum allocated to the church, another to the vicarage for upkeep. But his nieces and nephews, not all are equally favored. Edward, for instance, receives little, while Philip, a little more. And then there is Miss Worthing, a niece from London. She is designated as custodian of certain letters and papers." Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, connecting threads. Differences in inheritance often stirred up old grievances, especially among siblings. Yet she knew that Dr. Haydock had been a careful man, meticulous in his affairs. Any deviation would have had a reason. Her next stop was Dr. Haydock's residence, a modest house on the edge of the village. Clara Worthing had invited her to review some letters and personal effects, claiming they might provide clues to her uncle's sudden death. Inside, the house smelled faintly of antiseptic and aged wood, with the faint sweetness of flowers lingering from yesterday's funeral. Clara led Miss Marple to the study, where a small desk sat in front of a large window. Letters and papers were spread neatly across the surface. "These," Clara explained, "are instructions he left regarding certain patients and family matters. But something feels wrong. Some of the letters are missing, and there are notes that seem erased or altered." Miss Marple picked up a small envelope, examining it carefully. The handwriting was precise, but certain words had faint smudges. "Ah," she murmured. "It appears someone handled these letters after they were written." She tapped her finger gently. "These are minor clues, but clues nonetheless. One can often tell more from what is absent than what is present." As the morning turned into afternoon, Miss Marple began speaking with the family. She found Edward Haydock in the sitting room, pacing restlessly. He was tall, angular, and looked far more anxious than a man mourning a father might naturally appear. "Miss Marple," he said sharply, I can't understand why Clara is here. I barely knew her growing up, yet she insinuates herself into our affairs." Miss Marple regarded him carefully. "And yet, Edward, her concern for her uncle's affairs may be genuine. But it is clear that your father's recent actions, his letters and instructions, have unsettled you." Edward looked away, biting his lip. "Yes, unsettled is the word. But I had expected that at least one of us would inherit more. Father always said he wanted fairness." "And do you believe your father was unfair?" Miss Marple asked softly. Edward hesitated, then shook his head. "Not unfair, just surprising. He favored others in ways I didn't understand." Philip Haydock, Edward's younger brother, appeared next, entering with a calm, almost studied composure. "Miss Marple," he said politely, "Edward exaggerates. Father's intentions were clear to me. Perhaps I am simply less disappointed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Disappointment has a very curious way of revealing character. Some people handle it with grace, others with less charm. As the day progressed, Miss Marple moved through the household, speaking quietly with the housekeeper, Mrs. Hargreaves. The stout woman, who had been loyal to Dr. Haydock for decades, seemed fearful yet eager to share information. "It's all very strange, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hargreaves confided. "The doctor was fine in the morning. He even spoke cheerfully at breakfast. Then, well, he was gone. And those letters. I don't know who took them, or why." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "People often take what they feel as theirs, Mrs. Hargreaves. But sometimes, they take what belongs to no one at all, until the right time." By late afternoon, Miss Marple had observed several small but telling details. Clara Worthing's meticulous attention to the letters, suggesting a deeper knowledge of the family dynamics than she revealed. Edward Haydock's restless anxiety, hinting at a sense of entitlement thwarted. Philip Haydock's calm, possibly self-serving composure, which often concealed more than it revealed. Mrs. Hargreaves's fear and hesitation, implying that she had witnessed or suspected something but was reluctant to speak openly. Minor discrepancies in the household routines, like misplaced items and subtle disturbances in Dr. Haydock's study, which suggested that someone had tampered with his affairs after his death. As evening fell, Miss Marple retired to her room at the local inn, reflecting on the day's observations. The village itself seemed ordinary, almost peaceful, yet she knew better. Beneath the prim facades, the polite nods, and the carefully chosen words, lay currents of envy, resentment, and hidden agendas. Her thoughts returned to the letters. Why had Dr. Haydock been so careful to leave instructions for their safekeeping? Why had some gone missing, and why did Mrs. Hargreaves seem so nervous? As she sipped her tea, she murmured to herself, "There is more here than meets the eye." Someone desired to control what was revealed after his death, and someone else, perhaps, had something to gain from his absence. The stage was set. Miss Marple knew that in the coming days, the truth would reveal itself in fragments, small words, subtle gestures, and, inevitably, in human error. And she, with her quiet patience and keen observation, would piece those fragments together, as one might assemble a delicate mosaic. But for now, she allowed herself the smallest satisfaction, a certainty that the threads of this mystery were beginning to show themselves, and that St. Mary Mead, in its quaint exterior, held secrets that were anything but ordinary. The days following Dr. Haydock's funeral were unusually tense for the village of St. Mary Mead. The village's routine rhythms, market visits, tea at the vicarage, and the quiet comings and goings along the cobbled lanes, proceeded as normal on the surface, yet beneath that ordinariness lingered an unmistakable undercurrent of anxiety. Miss Marple, as always, moved quietly through the village, taking note of subtle changes. It was on a brisk morning, with frost clinging to the hedgerows, that Miss Marple made her way to Clara Worthing's temporary lodgings in the village. Clara had requested her assistance to sort through the remaining letters and papers Dr. Haydock had left behind. She greeted Miss Marple with a tension in her voice that she could not entirely mask. "Miss Marple, I've found something odd," Clara whispered, holding up a folded note that had been tucked behind the doctor's ledger. The paper was aged and yellowed, the handwriting hurried and somewhat erratic. "I'm certain this wasn't here before the funeral." Miss Marple took the note, carefully unfolding it. Her eyes, as keen as ever, traced the words. "Be cautious of Edward, he watches too closely, the ledger is not what it seems." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "It appears your uncle suspected interference even among his own family. And yet, he wrote these words with the expectation that someone would find them only after his passing. That is very deliberate." Clara shivered. "But why would he single out Edward? Surely he loved both his sons equally?" "Ah," Miss Marple said gently, "the heart may love, but the mind often recognizes danger in unexpected quarters. Edward, perhaps, has ambitions that were at odds with his father's intentions. We must observe him carefully." Miss Marple's suspicions were confirmed later that day when she visited the Haydock household under the pretext of discussing arrangements for Dr. Haydock's papers. She found Edward alone in the study, ostensibly reviewing financial documents. "Good afternoon, Edward," she said pleasantly. "I wondered if you might tell me about the ledger. Clara mentioned it was irregular." Edward's eyes flickered nervously, and he straightened suddenly. "Irregular? It's merely accounts, Miss Marple. Father was very precise about his finances." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, as if accepting the explanation, but her mind catalogued every twitch, every hesitation. She noticed a faint smudge on Edward's cuff, as though he had been handling ink or paper recently. And there was the faint scent of chemicals, a subtle whiff of antiseptic that reminded her, oddly enough, of Dr. Haydock's surgery. Later, she sought out Philip, whose calm and measured demeanor contrasted sharply with Edward's restless energy. "Philip," she began, "your brother seems unsettled by the contents of your father's papers. Did you notice anything unusual?" Philip smiled faintly, a calculated expression that hinted at both control and concealment. "Unusual, perhaps. But Edward always exaggerates. I find it better not to dwell on trifles." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. Trifles are often very revealing. Even the smallest disturbance may hint at something significant. Philip's smile did not falter, but there was a subtle tightening at the corners of his eyes, something Miss Marple noted silently. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended the weekly tea at the vicarage, a setting she often found fruitful for observation. Mrs. Bantry had arranged the usual assortment of scones, jam, and clotted cream, and the vicar, Reverend Carruthers, presided over polite conversation. Yet Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the interactions among the village's key figures. Miss Emily Winter, the florist, sat quietly, offering polite smiles and engaging in small talk about chrysanthemums and autumn markets. Yet Miss Marple noticed her glancing frequently toward Clara Worthing, her eyes wary. It seemed Emily harbored a suspicion, or perhaps a secret, regarding the niece's presence in the village. "Miss Winter," Miss Marple ventured gently, "you seem particularly interested in Miss Worthing's affairs. Are you concerned for her, or perhaps for someone else?" Emily faltered slightly, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. I suppose I worry, Miss Marple, about the influence of outsiders on our community. The Haydock family has been private for so long. One does not wish complications." Miss Marple nodded. "Complications, indeed. But sometimes, the best insight comes from those who observe from the edge. The conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion outside the window. A postman had arrived, carrying a letter addressed to Clara. She accepted it with a trembling hand, opening it quickly. Miss Marple observed without comment as Clara's expression shifted from hope to shock and then to apprehension. "It's a warning," Clara whispered. "Someone knows I'm examining these papers. Someone doesn't want me to proceed." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And that, my dear, confirms that the matter is more serious than it appears. We must proceed cautiously. Observe, but reveal little. The culprit often acts most boldly when they believe no one is paying attention." Over the next several days, Miss Marple conducted a careful series of inquiries, each revealing new layers of complexity. She discovered that Edward Haydock had visited the surgery the day before the funeral, insisting on reviewing his father's medical records. Some of the entries had been altered, suggesting an attempt to obscure the truth about Dr. Haydock's final hours. Philip Haydock had quietly secured the study, claiming it was for safekeeping, yet Miss Marple noted subtle signs that he had moved papers and objects recently. Clara Worthing possessed a keen knowledge of Dr. Haydock's affairs, yet she hesitated when Miss Marple probed about letters that were allegedly missing. Mrs. Hargreaves had seen someone entering the study late the evening before the doctor's death, but her vague recollection failed to identify who it was. Emily Winter revealed that she had overheard fragments of a conversation between Edward and an unknown visitor, mentioning sums of money, the ledger, and disappearing evidence. As Miss Marple pieced these details together, several misleads presented themselves. Edward's visible agitation and the mysterious visitor suggested he might have had a motive, yet Miss Marple knew better than to take appearances at face value. Philip's calm exterior could conceal guilt, or a careful strategy to protect family reputation. Clara's knowledge of the letters suggested access and potential motive, yet it could equally reflect devotion and concern. The pivotal twist came one evening when Miss Marple returned to the Haydock residence to review the remaining papers. While examining the study, she discovered a small vial hidden behind the books on a lower shelf, a vial containing a harmless-looking liquid, yet the faint scent of almonds suggested a chemical compound that could be toxic. Her heart quickened. Someone had access to the study, had handled the papers, and had left this vial behind. The implications were clear. Dr. Haydock's death might indeed have been hastened by deliberate intervention, and the perpetrator was likely someone within the household, someone with intimate knowledge of his routines. Miss Marple carefully bagged the vial and considered the evidence. She could see the web forming, letters tampered with, accounts disturbed, a hidden vial, and the ever-shifting behavior of the Haydock family. Yet, as is often the case, the true motive would not be found in the obvious clues, but in human nature itself, the small jealousies, resentments, and desires that underlie even the most respectable lives. The next morning, Miss Marple attended a local market, where she casually observed the villagers while purchasing groceries. She noted subtle interactions, Edward lingering near Clara's lodgings, Philip exchanging curt nods with the solicitor, Emily Winter watching from a distance, and Mrs. Hargreaves moving about as though weighed by a secret. And then, a startling development. A letter arrived at the vicarage, addressed to Miss Marple. It contained only a single sentence. "The truth is nearer than you think. Watch the one who smiles too easily." Miss Marple studied the paper carefully, noting the handwriting and the type of ink. Whoever sent it had an intimate knowledge of the ongoing investigation and clearly wished to influence her perceptions. As the afternoon sun fell behind the hills, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and reflected on the events. Several things were now evident. Someone within the Haydock household had manipulated letters and papers to conceal or alter the perception of Dr. Haydock's final days. There were competing motives among the family members: greed, resentment, and perhaps fear of exposure. External observers, the florist, the solicitor, even the vicar, had glimpsed certain truths but were either unwilling or unable to speak openly. The presence of the vial suggested that Dr. Haydock's death may not have been entirely natural, yet it was subtle, designed to look like an accident or illness. Miss Marple settled by the fire with her cup of tea, her mind working quietly but relentlessly. She reflected on the patterns, the inconsistencies, and the human behavior she had observed. The red herrings were numerous: Edward's agitation, Philip's composure, Clara's knowledge, Mrs. Hargreaves's fear, but one detail stood out to her, as always, the small, easily overlooked actions. And there it was, the faint, almost imperceptible signs that someone had overplayed their part. The smiles too broad, the hands too steady, the footsteps too quiet. In the village of St. Mary Mead, where life seemed tranquil and predictable, human nature had introduced its own chaos, leaving subtle traces that only a careful observer could detect. Miss Marple knew, with her usual quiet certainty, that the truth would soon be revealed. But for now, the threads were tangled, the suspects numerous, and the tension in the village palpable. The stage was set for the revelation, where hidden motives, clandestine actions, and clever misdirections would come together in a solution as intricate and precise as the puzzle itself. The morning was crisp and clear, with the fog of the previous days lifted from St. Mary Mead, leaving the village sparkling under a pale autumn sun. Miss Marple walked through the quiet lanes with her habitual calm, a basket of groceries swinging from her arm. But beneath her serene exterior, her mind was alert, tracing connections and observing patterns that had been invisible to others. The village, of course, appeared ordinary. Children ran along the cobblestones, their laughter ringing in the chill air. Shopkeepers arranged their displays, and the scent of baking bread drifted from the bakery. Yet Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that the extraordinary often hid within the ordinary, saw the subtle clues in gestures and glances. She began her day at the Haydock residence, invited by Clara Worthing to examine more of Dr. Haydock's personal papers. As she entered the study, her eyes immediately caught the faint smudge of ink on the edge of the ledger, a detail she had noted before but now examined with greater scrutiny. She held the ledger close, feeling the slight indentations of letters that had been erased and rewritten. "This," she murmured softly, "is no ordinary oversight." Clara, hovering nearby, looked puzzled. "Do you mean someone deliberately altered it?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, my dear. Someone wanted to disguise certain entries, either to hide their own involvement or to mislead others. And considering the timing, it must have been done after your uncle's death." Edward Haydock appeared in the doorway, his expression sharp and defensive. "Miss Marple, surely you are not implying that anyone here is dishonest?" "We are grieving our father." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, met his. "Grief can be sincere, Edward, but the desire to secure one's future, that is another matter entirely. I am simply observing what the evidence suggests." Edward flushed but said nothing. Miss Marple's intuition told her that his defensiveness was expected, but not conclusive. Next, she turned her attention to Philip, who had been quietly arranging books on a shelf. She noted the subtle alignment of the papers, too precise to be casual. "Philip," she said gently, "you have taken care to restore order here, have you not? Perhaps more carefully than the rest of us might expect." Philip's calm eyes met hers, unwavering. "I only wish to maintain some semblance of the order your uncle valued, Miss Marple." "Surely that is not surprising?" "No, indeed," she said softly. "And yet, it is often in the very care with which people conceal their actions that the truth lies." Miss Marple spent the afternoon reviewing the letters and documents, noting small but telling details. Certain phrases in Dr. Haydock's handwriting suggested premeditation. He had anticipated interference. Entries in the ledger had been altered posthumously, but the person who did so had overlooked a tiny smudge that betrayed the timing. The vial discovered earlier, containing a subtle poison, had fingerprints that were not immediately visible but detectable under careful observation. By evening, Miss Marple had constructed a mental map of motives and opportunity. Edward's agitation and interference with the medical records suggested greed, but the subtle traces indicated he had acted out of fear rather than malice. Clara's careful handling of the letters suggested devotion, yet she too had been drawn into the web of secrecy inadvertently. Philip, by contrast, displayed a measured composure, but Miss Marple noted a small tell. The slightly worn cuff of his sleeve suggested he had handled the vial, perhaps unknowingly leaving the chemical trace that caused his father's sudden illness. The breakthrough came when Miss Marple visited Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper. The woman, usually nervous, now seemed almost relieved to see her. "Miss Marple," she said in a hushed tone, "I think I can explain everything. I was afraid before, but I cannot keep it to myself any longer. It was Philip. I saw him handling the vial late in the evening before the funeral. He said he was making sure nothing was left behind that could be dangerous. He didn't mean any harm, but, well, my instinct tells me he went further than he should have." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. "Mrs. Hargreaves, you are certain it was Philip handling the vial?" "Yes," the housekeeper said, wringing her hands. "He was careful, too careful. And the ledger, he moved it to hide the smudges, I think. He wanted it to look as if Edward had tampered with it. The pieces fell into place. Philip, ever the calm and calculating brother, had handled the vial, perhaps intending only to protect, perhaps with a more subtle plan in mind, but in doing so, he had inadvertently contributed to his father's death. He had also tried to manipulate appearances, shifting suspicion toward Edward while keeping Clara unaware of the exact danger. Miss Marple reflected on the motivations. Philip, meticulous, calculating, with a desire to control outcomes and protect the family's reputation. His actions were careful, yet ultimately misguided. Edward, agitated, greedy, and fearful of disinheritance, but ultimately uninvolved in the actual cause of death. Clara, devoted and conscientious, seeking to preserve her uncle's legacy, unwittingly caught in the family tensions. Mrs. Hargreaves, loyal, observant, and fearful, she held crucial witness knowledge. With these insights, Miss Marple arranged to gather the key figures at the Haydock residence for a careful explanation. The evening meeting was quiet, with the golden light of lamps reflecting off the polished wood of the study. Edward, Philip, Clara, and Mrs. Hargreaves were present, as well as Miss Marple herself. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began, "I have spent the past several days observing, questioning, and reflecting on the events surrounding Dr. Haydock's sudden passing. It is clear that his death was hastened, not by malice, but by unintended consequences arising from human anxiety and misjudgment." She looked directly at Philip. "You handled the vial, did you not? Perhaps intending only to ensure nothing dangerous was left behind, but in doing so, you interfered with your father's routine and inadvertently caused the situation to escalate." Philip's calm mask faltered. I only wanted to secure the house. I did not intend. I never meant to harm him." "No, you did not act with malice," Miss Marple said gently. "Yet, the effect was real. And in trying to maintain order and manipulate appearances, you unintentionally shifted suspicion to your brother and caused much anxiety for the family." Edward's face softened, relief mingling with lingering frustration. "So it wasn't me? I only acted out of fear." "Indeed, Edward," Miss Marple replied. "Your actions were driven by emotion, not malice. And Clara, your careful attention has ensured that your uncle's legacy is preserved." Mrs. Hargreaves, your observations were invaluable. Without your keen eye, the truth might have remained hidden. A quiet understanding fell over the room. The tension eased, replaced by a collective recognition that while the circumstances had been tragic, the cause was subtle human error rather than deliberate villainy. Miss Marple concluded, sometimes, the most complex mysteries are resolved not by grand revelations or dramatic confrontations, but by observing the small truths, the gestures, and the human foibles that lie beneath the surface. St. Mary Mead is fortunate that these events, though unsettling, have revealed more about our character than our malice. The atmosphere in the room softened. Philip nodded solemnly, Edward offered a tentative smile, and Clara's eyes glistened with gratitude. Even Mrs. Hargreaves allowed herself a small, relieved smile. Miss Marple, as always, reflected quietly that justice and understanding need not always be dramatic. They could be gentle, discerning, and precise, much like the careful assembly of a delicate puzzle. The morning after Miss Marple's careful revelation arrived with a gentle warmth unusual for late autumn. Sunlight streamed into the quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, highlighting the golden hue of fallen leaves and casting long, soft shadows across the cobbled lanes. The village, which had been tense and quietly anxious for weeks, seemed to breathe more freely, as though a hidden weight had been lifted. Miss Marple, as ever, began her day with a brisk walk through the village, greeting familiar faces with her customary courtesy. Mrs. Bantry appeared at her gate, knitting basket in hand, and smiled warmly. "Well, Jane, I dare say that funeral has left quite a stir in St. Mary Mead," Mrs. Bantry said. "I cannot recall so much tension and speculation all at once." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, Dolly. Yet sometimes it is these very disturbances that reveal the most about people. One observes what they do, rather than what they say, and the truth comes forward in the gentlest of ways." Mrs. Bantry chuckled softly. "And you, Jane, are the gentlest observer I know. The villagers might feel uneasy, but I suspect they are all relieved that matters are clarified." The clarity came from Miss Marple's careful explanation of the events surrounding Dr. Haydock's sudden death. By piecing together subtle observations, letters, the tampered ledger, and the vial, she had demonstrated that the tragedy, while serious, was ultimately the result of human error rather than malicious intent. Philip Haydock, having confessed to handling the vial in an attempt to secure the house, had been spared the stigma of intentional wrongdoing. Miss Marple's gentle approach allowed him to understand the consequences of his actions without condemnation, and Edward, though initially anxious and accusatory, could finally release the tension that had built in his chest. Clara Worthing, whose concern for her uncle's legacy had driven her actions, now felt validated and relieved. Miss Marple's reflection on the affair focused not only on the events themselves but on the subtle dynamics of human nature. She often found that the most seemingly ordinary individuals could conceal deep intentions, fears, or misjudgments. In the case of the Haydocks, it was precisely these hidden layers that had led to confusion and suspicion, and it was only by observing the minute details, the tremble of a hand, the faint smudge of ink, a glance too quickly averted, that the truth could be revealed. As word of the investigation's conclusion spread through the village, the residents of St. Mary Mead began to restore their usual calm routines. Emily Winter, the florist, felt a sense of relief, her suspicion of Clara eased by Miss Marple's explanation of the niece's honesty and devotion. Mr. Lawrence Rivington, the solicitor, made arrangements to properly secure Dr. Haydock's papers and settle the minor inheritance disputes, ensuring that fairness and transparency prevailed. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the Haydock household returned to normal. Philip quietly took measures to rectify the disordered papers and accounts, Edward gradually accepted the fairness of the bequests, and Clara carefully arranged the letters for safekeeping. Mrs. Hargreaves, relieved that the mystery had been resolved, resumed her duties with a lighter step, grateful that the household could function without suspicion or fear. Miss Marple, reflecting in her cozy cottage one afternoon, poured herself a cup of tea and gazed out at the quiet village lane. The hedgerows were already turning to brown, the autumn leaves carpeting the paths in golden hues. She thought about the subtle webs of human behavior she had witnessed, the anxious gestures, the overcareful hands, the silent tensions hidden behind polite smiles. It is curious, she mused aloud, how small acts of caution or misunderstanding can grow into perceived malice. And yet, the truth, gentle though it may be, always finds a way to make itself known. Her thoughts wandered to Dr. Haydock himself. He had been a meticulous, caring man, concerned with his patients and family alike. In death, he had left a puzzle, not one of malice or vengeance, but a puzzle born from the ordinary foibles of human nature, fear, ambition, and overzealous care. It was, in a way, a testament to his character that his final legacy had prompted such reflection and careful attention. That evening, Miss Marple took her accustomed seat by the fire, a knitting project in her lap, and sipped her tea. She smiled faintly, thinking of the Haydocks and the lessons of the past week. Some mysteries, she reflected, require neither a dramatic confrontation nor a criminal trial. They require patience, observation, and an understanding of human nature. And sometimes, the simplest act, watching, listening, and waiting, reveals more than any accusation or interrogation ever could. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead settled into its usual rhythm. Children played along the lanes, the bakery scent mingled with the crisp air, and the faint chiming of the church bells echoed across the hills. Life continued, orderly and calm once more, as though the disturbances of recent days had never occurred. Yet beneath that calm, Miss Marple knew, there would always be the subtle undercurrents of human ambition, jealousy, and fear, quiet currents that only the keen observer could discern. And she, with her patient eyes and gentle wit, would continue to watch, to notice, and to untangle the puzzles that life in St. Mary Mead inevitably provided. As the last light of the sun faded and the first stars appeared in the clear winter sky, Miss Marple set down her cup of tea, adjusted her knitting, and allowed herself a quiet smile. The mystery had been resolved, the village was at peace, and once again, human nature had revealed itself in all its quiet complexity. For now, at least, all was right in St. Mary Mead.